Well, Annette Scott reported in a recent Farmers Weekly that COVID-19 has created huge economic damage. We know that, but it's not such a bad space for New Zealand velvet producers to be in right now. Deer Industry New Zealand Velvet Marketing Manager Rhys Griffiths says New Zealand deer velvet products are enjoying some strong underlying consumer demand despite a very uncertain world. But the key point is not how current opposing factors will influence these prices to farmers in the coming season. And Rhys joins us now here on Sarah's Country. Evening, Rhys.
G'day, Sarah. How are you?
Good. This has been a moving feast for deer farmers this year, COVID. But in terms of velvet, how is the market placed with uncertain times?
Yeah, well, still not there, unfortunately. I'd love to be on the program tonight to be able to say, hey, look, the velvet season's well underway and things are looking okay. You're dead right with the intro. The underlying demand is certainly looking very good up in the markets. But in terms of getting product to market, that's kind of the key issue. And that, there are a couple of kind of issues there. The physical ability to get product up to the market. So air freight has got very, very costly. We're trying to encourage, I guess, our key customers up in those markets to be well planned, booking their sea freight well in advance. But it's actually also the financial consideration. So actually getting money down, getting the buyers well invested to be able to get out there and start buying velvet. So that's a big issue. We know that the commodity traders, they profit out of instability. And I guess we've seen a lot of good stability in the velvet industry over the last kind of 8 to 10 years. And, they kind of, this time of year, they kind of use any excuse really to look to drive down prices where they can. And they've got a pretty big excuse around the kind of the global economic impact. But what I really try and do is give the facts to particularly our key customers, and the facts are pretty clear. When we look at the two biggest markets for New Zealand velvet, it goes into China, which the IMF has come out and said that they predict an actual growth in their GDP this year of 1.8% and a pretty significant growth of over 8% next year. And then we look at South Korea as our biggest consumer market, and they're going to be the best performing economy in the OECD this year. So actually the markets are looking pretty good. So we also know that there have been a number of new velvet products launched into the market this year, around about 20, and I think something like 17 of them use New Zealand velvet as their preferred ingredient. We're in over 85% of all the major food type products. So it is my belief that that velvet consumption, the underlying demand in those markets, will continue to strengthen. I don't see any drop in the consumption of velvet, but as I say, it's about getting product to market. And when we think about velvet's main use, so it's used mainly for anti-fatigue and immune function properties. We're in a pretty good space with those types of usage profiles. The companies, the food companies, so that the reason why we've had this good underlying demand over the last 8 to 10 years is this kind of transition into these kind of more novel, healthy food type products, which are trendy and used by executives. So that transition has helped to underpin the market somewhat. But as I say, probably about 60% of New Zealand's velvet still goes into that commodity trade, and it's those big importers from northern China and some of them from South Korea that are a bit nervous about sending out lots of money, and as they're pretty uncertain in this or risk adverse, I guess, in this uncertain world.
I'm struggling to wrap my Economics 101 supply and demand head around the comments you've just made. If there is such strong consumer demand and a shortage of supply, usually the price goes this way.
Yeah, they do. I'm not saying there's shortage of supply. So production, Access. We know production has been increasing over the last few years. In fact, our production levels have about doubled from 431 tonnes back in 2010 to about 850. Our budget for this coming year is pushing up towards the late 800 tonnes. So production has been increasing, and I guess but we know that consumption has been increasing too. So it's about getting that mix right between consumption increasing and production increasing. There's always velvet at the end of every season. The way that our production cycle goes and the way that main velvet's consumption goes in the market, the main consumption peaks are about now, and then later on in our summer or going into their spring, into their summer, so the end of their winter in Northern Asia. So there's always some of our velvet left at the end of the season before it gets processed for consumption that's left over and held over into the following year. So some of those northern traders would be probably sitting on 300 to 400 tonnes. I'm not frightened by that figure, but it does mean that there's a bit of a buffer for them carrying over into the new season as well. So that supply and demand thing, it sits well. We are trying to up the ante a little bit, saying, hey, look, there are some concerns about the supply channel, so make sure you keep product moving through. But to date, we still really need to get that season off the ground.
What's the correlation like for supply in terms of deer farmers here in New Zealand getting out of deer for venison to velvet? So if venison isn't performing, does it have a flow on to your supply for velvet?
Yeah, it can do. I guess in the past we've seen some of the bigger producers getting bigger, or some of the deer farmers that have velvet specific herds and venison specific herds. Some of those guys that run a velvet mob, they might have 200 or 300 stags. They might be getting a little bit bigger, rather than newer people getting into velvet as such.
Deer Industry New Zealand's been working alongside New Zealand Trade and Enterprise to open up and encourage and nurture these markets. What sort of response are you getting from that type of relationship and market?
Yeah, so a big shout out here to our government officials and particularly to NZTE. They've mobilised their business development managers who have got a good relationship through the 4 different posts in China, for example. So each one of those posts in Shanghai, in Guangzhou, in Chengdu, and in Beijing, they've got a BDM getting out and meeting with some of the big healthy food companies that we've been nurturing a relationship with over the last couple of years to get into this kind of healthy food side of things. In South Korea, we work really closely with the folk at the New Zealand Embassy, not just with NZT, but also MFAD as well. The ambassador, Philip Turner up there, has been pretty amazing for us, as was his predecessor, Claire Fernley, as well. So really, we are getting a lot of support from the New Zealand government, particularly in these couple of markets. Actually, in Taiwan as well, there was a new velvet product that was launched just about a month ago. Is this little stick by KGC, or Korean Ginseng Corp, into that market too, signalling that our global potential. So we do know that the medium outlook for velvet is looking pretty strong. We just have to weather the storm, I guess, over the next few months with this kind of global uncertainty that COVID is throwing on all of us.
Hey, Rhys, to close the show, what we are talking in general across the show tonight that I am throwing to our guests, very random, but what's your thoughts on fireworks as a family? Are you a sort of backyard fireworks where you're like, nope, we're public display only family?
Yeah, hey, classic. That's a really good question. I've always, to my wife's dismay, probably been a big boy at heart and love the old fireworks, particularly when the kids were growing up. But we're empty nesters now, and I guess we've got a pup at home that gets a bit frightened by these things. So things are changing a little bit for me. I do love the big fireworks display in my house in Wellington, overlook the city, and I used to love watching the city light up at night. So,
but as I said earlier in the show, I mean, why do we have to have fireworks in town till like 10:30 on a Monday night? For God's sake.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
These people don't think about, young children and whatever. But I mean, I'm sure it's bringing some joy to a few people.
Yeah, it certainly is.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, thank you so much, Rhys. Sorry for the bit of a sideline there, but fantastic news for deer farmers across New Zealand that the pathways for our velvet markets are looking stable, and the great work that Deer Industry New Zealand are doing, and particularly Rhys and his team in the velvet side of it, and all the suppliers and brand partners that work alongside them to ensure that our markets stay honest. That's a big thing that they do.
This is Sarah's Country.